It's not a major part of our study, but it's important to contextualize during this period in painting subjects of monks the concept and the phenomenon of the mendicant orders. St. Francis of Assisi in the 12th century and St. Dominic founded the mendicant orders. The mendicant orders refers to several Christian religious orders who adopted a lifestyle of poverty, traveling, um, and often living in urban, not rural areas for the purpose of preaching, especially to the poor. The foundation of these orders was about rejecting the previously established monastic model of living in one stable community where members worked at a trade, where monks made beer and cheese and harvested honey, and had communal property ownership, land, buildings. In complete contrast, the mendicants eschewed and avoided owning any kind of property, did not work at any kind of a trade, and embraced a poor, itinerant lifestyle. They depended for their survival on the goodwill of the people to whom they preached. Just as an aside, this all stems from St. Francis of Assisi's rejection of extravagance. Francis was actually the son of a wealthy merchant, textile cloth merchant, but gave that up to pursue his faith full time. As an exercise, looking at painters of this time stylistically, above in slide 65, we see St. Francis in Meditation by Zurbaran, and on the right, Manet of Olympia, Manet's Monk at Prayer. Quite different if we study the stylistic differences and techniques in both of these paintings. The one we are looking at here, on the left we see Manet, beggar, and on the right we see Velázquez, Aesop. When we talk about las meninas, or the maids, as in maids of honor, ladies in waiting of the court, we're talking about a painting that reset the perspective of the age of the 17th century. Velázquez takes the viewer into the painting in a completely new way and moves forward, advances this idea, this trajectory of how the viewer interacts with the artwork, with the painting, as a response to the painter's intention, and in a way that really shifts the era, the age of painting, and takes it to a whole other level. Velázquez is showing us that painting is something that is both literary and intellectual, that it resides in the realm of the aesthetic and intellectual liberal arts in a whole different way. Initially, this point of view is almost a disorienting one because he's shifting the focus. Velázquez's effort to elevate the art of painting onto this status, this new platform of liberal art, were something that he planned quite carefully and executed quite diligently. He knew that it was going to take time to get there. 2 years after he painted Las Meninas, he began campaigning for a knighthood under the king. He was absolutely convinced that his nobility was based over anything else on the nobility, on the quality, on the sheer excellence of his artwork. This induction into knighthood was a big deal for Diego Velázquez. It's quite possible that King Philip IV himself painted the Red Cross of the Knights of Santiago, into which Velázquez was initiated, on the tunic he's wearing. If we look at the painter himself standing back from his easel, looking out at us, on the left side of the canvas. Again, Velázquez really set out to reach this position of a Knight of Santiago and its noble status. It's also likely that the cross of St. James of a Knight of Santiago was painted on after Velázquez completed Las Meninas, probably when he was still alive. He was inducted into the order in 1659 after the king obtained a special dispensation from the Pope to elevate an artist onto this noble platform, and also to overrule doubts as to Velázquez's blood and trade. So we see here with both Caravaggio, a rough boy from the streets who was always suspected of being a murderer as well, and Velázquez being elevated by virtue of their art onto a whole different platform. Caravaggio for the way the emotional expressiveness of his images reached a populace, particularly an illiterate one, a tool of the church in a way. And Velázquez reaching this noble order through the elevation of his art. So art and artists are gaining a whole different kind of agency in the 17th century. What is the subject of this complex and fascinating portrait? Las Meninas is many things at once. It's a self-portrait by Velázquez. It's perhaps even something that can be characterized as a study, a portrait of the Infanta Margarita, who's the daughter, the young princess of King Philip IV. We see her with this uncanny, almost uncannily adult expression on her face as she looks out at us from the center of the portrait, her face slightly turned to the left. There's a sense of almost psychological perplexity and an adult knowingness about what is occurring in this multi-sided image that becomes the one that really cements Velázquez's reputation. It focuses on the young Margarita's beauty, her intelligence, and almost this curiosity, this keen curiosity about the visible world. So we're thinking about the idea of what's visible through painting and what is enclosed in it. In the background of the painting, there's a mirror. It reflects the upper bodies of the king and the queen. They appear to be outside of the picture space in a position similar to what we as the viewer are experiencing and looking at this painting. In the rear of the mirror of the painting, to the right of the mirror, we see Don José Nieto Velázquez, the Queen's Chamberlain, during the 1650s. So her sort of right-hand man, who also heads the royal tapestry works, who may even have been a relative of the artist. They're both Velázquez. The Infanta Margarita at the foreground in the center is surrounded by who? By her maids of honor, Las Meninas, the painting's title. Her entourage, a chaperone, a bodyguard, a female dwarf, not uncommon at all in the court at this time, and a midget, a young Italian boy who tries to wake up this sleepy dog, this large mastiff dog, with his foot. Again, behind them, Velázquez to the left is portraying himself working. And in addition to the cross, as we know painted on later, hang these symbolic keys to his court offices, let's say, or his studio. If we're looking back to Nieto, the Queen's Chamberlain, we see him pausing in the background, his right knee bent, his feet are in several steps, 2 steps rather. We see him almost in the sense of a silhouette, and he's poised. He pauses to hold open a curtain on a short flight of stairs. We can't quite see what's behind that. The vanishing point of the painting's perspective is in the doorway. It's thought that, in terms of the etiquette of the court at the time, that Nieto, as the Queen's attendant, her right-hand man, was required to be on hand at all times to open and to close doors for her. Again, we have this detail of the mirror showing the king, King Philip IV, and his wife, the Queen Mariana. There are nine figures in this painting. Five of them are looking directly out at us. Is it us or is it the royal couple? The royal couple who we see reflected in the mirror. Have the royal couple just entered this space, as do we, the viewer? So we are looking alongside with them at this scene. The glances of the five subjects in the painting, the 5 out of the 9 who are looking directly out at us, the viewer, or the royal couple, confirm their presence for us from the expressions on their faces. This is an unusually large canvas for Velázquez. His portraits were not previously so large, although there are others that are close to that after, in the wake of Las Meninas. It is the only known double portrait of the royal couple together, even though we only see them in such a modern, contemporary way. We only see them in the mirror. And let's think too about that Jeff Koons gazing ball that I'll say, in my view, thank goodness, he has not yet inserted and appropriated this image and had it reproduced in order to insert the gazing ball. But it brings us to the idea of what Jeff Koons does with these blue balls that shows us, the viewers, present in the painting. Again, as there continue to be, I will say that at this point in time, we begin to see paintings, other artwork that questions perspective in a way that has nothing to do with the linear, that has to do with the viewer and the viewer's relationship to what the artist has produced and what the artist intends with his newfound agency and status as an artist. It's sometimes said in critical art history debates that the point of view of the picture is really not that of the couple. So we, the viewer, and the royal couple may not be the most important element here. Again, we have Velázquez looking at, portraying himself, looking out at us, working on this large canvas. We don't see what the canvas is. He's looking outward, beyond the pictorial space, to where a viewer of the painting would stand. Let's also think again about the king and queen in the mirror, the way they seem to be placed outside in another dimension of the picture space by virtue of their being shown only in a mirror. Las Meninas is today we can say, although there's always controversy in art history circles, one of the things that is not controversial is that this is one of the most important paintings in the history of Western art. It is a supreme achievement on Velázquez's part, a highly self-conscious, very well-planned, calculated demonstration of what painting could achieve, and perhaps at that time, maybe even beyond that time, the most searching comment ever made on the possibilities of a painting, of a piece of canvas worked with paint on an easel. When we gaze upon the face, the visage of the lovely and the curious 5-year-old with such a worldliness and self-possession in her expression of the Infanta, of the Princess Margarita, I'm just asking us once again to think about what comes after that in its wake, in the wake of paintings as great as this one by Velázquez. To the right, we see Picasso. In a modernist time, generations and centuries later. But let's think about the way that painters, great Spanish painters, Velázquez, Goya, Picasso, in that pantheon, deal with and reimagine the subject of painting in their own ages. Let us also recall here the conceit, the idea, the trope, the use of the mirror as a tool in part of what the artist intends to express in a work such as Las Meninas, such as this. We're going back to the Arnolfini double portrait. Before we talk a little bit about the Rubens image, the self portrait of himself and his bride, Isabel Brandt, I want to address the term Rubenesque as we employ it, as it originated in art history. Rubenesque refers to these well rounded, curvy women, nudes. Even today, when we described a woman as Rubenesque, we're hearkening back, we're referring to this notion of fleshy in a very positive sense, female, that Peter Paul Rubens depicted so beautifully. This portrait that we can only imagine was so lovingly painted by Peter Paul Rubens um, with Isabel Brandt, his first wife. It's sometimes known as the honeysuckle bower. It's more or less a wedding portrait. It's a full-length double portrait, and the couple is seated in a bower, in a little arbor filled with honeysuckle. Hence the honeysuckle bower informal title. Well, not even informal. You will sometimes see it titled that, as opposed to self-portrait. We call it self-portrait. What do we see? This couple that look. They both look so happy, so robust, so devoted to each other. Um, Look at the way that they look so directly at us with their hands entwined. They're surrounded by love and marriage symbolism. The honeysuckle and garden are both traditional symbols of love, and the holding of their right hands represents union through marriage. Additionally, we see Rubens, who's depicting himself as an aristocratic gentleman, um, with his left hand resting on the hilt, on the top of his sword. Judith Leister is not on our lecture guide, but I'm just asking us to pause and consider this second self portrait by a leading renowned female artist. Judith Leister here, the other being the Artemisia Gentileschi. And the way that these two women, not just so masterfully, but in original ways, capture the essence of what it means to be a potent painter of female gender in an age when very few existed. In the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp by Rembrandt, we have this marvelous use of tenebrism, of the use of light and dark that we associate originally with Caravaggio. What is this here? It is one of the, it is the only that year allowable public dissection of a cadaver. These often happened in theater like settings and were demonstrations on the part of surgeons, medical professionals for medical students. Here we see the left arm of the cadaver being dissected and explained by the surgeon in charge. To his right, to his left, depending on our view of the painting, to his left, in terms of how the subjects are placed, we see a large text that is thought to be perhaps the first study of human anatomy. We can, when we move ahead by 2 centuries to the late 19th century, 1875, think about this image and we'll revisit Dr. Nicholas Tulp when we look at the American painters Thomas Eakins' Gross Clinic, which is a similar painting, 1875, of a surgery. And here we have that very painting, Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic, again, over 200 let's see, 1632 to 1875, 250 years later, but um, the subject for one of two paintings that are an interesting comparison. This marvelous second painting we're looking at by Rembrandt, which we will refer to as the Night Watch, not by its longer title, is renowned for three characteristics. And it's enormous, quite colossal at the time size, 12 feet by 14 and a half feet. It's very effective use of light and shadow, tenebrism again, and third, the perception of this motion in what would traditionally have been a very static military portrait, where you would have seen the subjects more or less lined up as opposed to being so active. This is a painting that comes at the peak of the Dutch Golden Age, the mid-17th century, 1642. It depicts the company, the eponymous company, if we're thinking of the title, the company of Captain Franz Banninkoek, moving out, led by the captain, who's the one dressed in black with a red sash, and his lieutenant, von Rutenburg, dressed in yellow with the white sash. And in using sunlight and shade, dark and light, so effectively, Rembrandt leads the eye to the three most important characters in this crowd. The two gentlemen in the center, from whom the painting gets its title. Again, we refer to it as the Night Watch. And the women in the center, she's carrying a chicken. The company's colors are carried by its ensign. The way Rembrandt has displayed the traditional military emblems of this troop in a very natural is a very natural one. And the woman in the background, again, is carrying the symbols of it. She's kind of mascot herself. The claws of a dead chicken on her belt, the pistol behind the chicken representing clover, emblematic of this troop, and she's holding the militia's goblet, official goblet. Behind her, we see a man, well, actually in front of her, wearing a helmet with an oak leaf, a traditional motif of this military troop. The idea of the dead chicken is also, it's meant to represent defeating an adversary. And the color yellow is often associated in this nation at that time with victory. One interpretation proposes that Rembrandt designed this painting with several layers of meaning, as was common at the time, increasingly so. Multiple interpretations were possible in works by the most talented of artists. We can think of Velázquez and Las Meninas, the maids. So the systematic division to illustrate the union here between Dutch Protestants and Dutch Catholics in the Night Watch is one major theme. Secondly, it represents the war effort, this united war effort against the Spaniards. There's a very multi-layered design occurring here. The captain, again in black, who's taller, symbolizes the Dutch Protestant leadership, and the Dutch Catholics, represented by the shorter lieutenant in yellow, unite in their goal of defeating the Spanish adversary. The other important thing about the Night Watch, because the canvas is so large, is that the figures are nearly human size, and we feel this vibrancy with which Rembrandt was able to inject into his subjects that in a way that they look like they're almost going to walk right off the canvas and into real space. In the Three Crosses, we're looking at one of Rembrandt's finest works in any medium. Here, it really represents the culmination of his virtuosity, his technical skill as a printmaker. He's drawing on copper plate. He's drawing on it entirely in dry point. Dry point is a technique that cuts into the copper of the plate upon which his image is made. So it allows him to fully use these velvety areas of burr that the dry point tool creates. It requires a great deal of technical skill and ability to be able to create this kind of impression. When Rembrandt did so here, he left, quite deliberately, he left the ink on the printing plate. And this approach to technique lightly veils the figure standing at the foot of the cross on the right hand side. A thicker layer almost completely covers the bushes shown in this image along the edge, along the right edge. And in his way of creatively using this technique in inking this copper plate, in a certain way, Rembrandt is painting, even though he's using a different technique, he's using it to render the idea of painting each impression. Every time he printed a copper plate, he made a unique work from it. So they were one-offs, one of a kind. And then he also varied the impressions of this copper plate printing method. And sometimes they were printed on vellum, which infuses this very warm light, as vellum does, onto the surface. It's less absorbent than paper as a medium vellum or as a surface, and it holds ink in a way that softens its lines, and overall this enhances the richness of this technique's effect. So again, the Three Crosses it's an etching and it's a dry point by Rembrandt. And what does it do? It depicts the crucifixion of Jesus. In the art pantheon, this is considered one of the most dynamic, one of the most forcefully made and emotionally expressive prints ever made, prints made in this technique. The main subject, of course, is Jesus on the cross, who are flanked by, hence the three crosses, the two thieves who in the biblical story are crucified alongside him. We see the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, as we have seen in earlier works such as the Deposition. Here weeping, supported Roman soldiers along with grieving citizens around the crosses. There's a beam of light representing God's light like a message from heaven to his son, piercing the sky and really kind of enveloping Jesus' crucified frame, his figure. The really intricate iconography of this etching and the symbols of it are thought to represent the exact moment of Christ's death. The biblical text for Matthew of that moment is when Christ cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" at his worst moment. So Rembrandt's drawing quite heavily, if we keep a verse like that in the back of our heads, Rembrandt's drawing quite heavily on biblical sources, as well as reflecting some of the techniques of his Baroque contemporaries. We don't see dramatic contrasts of light and shade here. We don't see chiaroscuro. We don't see tenebrism. Rembrandt produced this work in 4 stages, in each one increasing the effects of the light and shade. Etching and dry point are pretty labor-intensive processes, and we consider them as one of the early forms of printmaking. Again, Rembrandt being a master printmaker. Why did Rembrandt make these? And why did he sell them? He needed money. Rembrandt was almost always broke. And when we look at the self-portrait we have of him, one of the ones he made in his later years, we can sometimes see that economic hardship and his weariness from struggling for really all of his life on his face. Just to detail some of the intricate stages involved here, Rembrandt made around 60 impressions from the plate here in the 3 crosses. And as a note, he actually had to sell many of his etchings in order to be able to afford to print it himself. There wasn't patronage present here when he made this. So he made around 60 impressions from the plate in 3 stages. The darkest were done in dry point, and Christ and the lighter figures were etched. So there was this continuity and alternating of technique between the etching and the dry point that changed the composition of picture. In the final stages of it, the Virgin Mary is an almost disembodied head surrounded by darkness. And this dramatic contrast in light may have been something that Rembrandt intended in order to heighten the contrast between light and darkness, and as also as a way of distinguishing the good thief from the bad thief. This idea of creating a dialogue, in a sense, between the painter and his audience is perfectly represented by Woman Holding a Balance. It very much fits into the Vanitas, as it's called, theme. Um, that has to do with elements of a painting, sometimes very bluntly a skull that referred to mortality, to the transience of human earthly life. Here, as this woman stands beneath or underneath a painting to her right of the Last Judgment, we get quite a poignant, particularly as she appears pregnant, um, association with this idea of human mortality. Only 34 paintings have been attributed to Vermeer over the course of his lifetime. It's quite astounding, and I think it's fair to say that perhaps no artist except Vermeer can boast such an outstanding ratio of masterworks to total artistic output, meaning almost everything he painted was a masterwork, what would be considered perhaps for another artist the pinnacle of his career. There have been many paintings over the years attributed to Vermeer, many forgeries, and again, many misattributions. Vermeer worked very slowly in terms of the way he built up his paint, which were always about these interior scenes that contain this distilled core of quietness and are often thought of as quite mysterious and enigmatic. To this day, art historians, art critics, poets, filmmakers. There was a film made 2 or 3 years ago about Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, one of his most famous paintings. People have been intrigued by, fascinated, and curious about Vermeer as a painter. Just a few years ago, even in the Netherlands, the homeland of both Vermeer and Rembrandt, Vermeer was granted a #1 position as the nation's most cherished painter in a public poll. His ability to achieve this sinister, this top position of artistic perfection is something that, again, is not attributed in the very same way to an artist who has so few, barely just under 3 dozen paintings to his credit during the course of his career. He didn't enjoy such esteem or acclamation during his lifetime. But again, Vermeer's paintings, in terms of the way we can take apart also these elements, if we are looking at Women Holding a Balance here, what occurs in this painting, what the painting hanging on the right on the wall to the backdrop of this young woman holding a balance represents. Is she pregnant? What is she weighing? Are some of the questions we ask ourselves. Just a few other things to note about Vermeer's Woman Holding a Balance. At one time, this painting was known as Woman Weighing God, but closer evaluation of the balance, as you'll see in one of the details here, one of the detailed slides, shows us that the balance in her hands, in fact, is empty, which further increases the enigma of this work. It's just another as are all his works, really, superb examples of Vermeer's exquisite sense of composition and the way that he establishes the different elements within a painting to achieve a uniform, we could call it a rhythm even. We see this woman dressed in a blue jacket with fur trim, and the scales in her hand seem at equilibrium, which are perhaps, we think, suggestive of her inner state of mind, being one of serenity. We also see behind her the painting on the wall as the Last Judgment, which introduces, um, actually re emphasizes the idea of balance between life and death, um, and even the outcomes of good and evil on earth as they translate to the life in heaven that follows our life on earth. Jacob van Ruysdael's view of Haarlem from the dunes at Overveen is a painting filled with signs of the protection and prosperity that the Dutch credited to God's providence, to God smiling upon the Dutch people. Ruysdael is one of the greatest Netherlands painters, landscape painters at this time in the 17th century, and primarily a painter of nature. Um, in contrast, some of his predecessors, including family members, were painting signs of human activity outdoors, and Ruysdael's were always landscapes. The nature was always the subject. In the work of these other painters, landscape sort of occupied a stage as one that was background or just context to the human subject, which was more prominent. Again, in Ruysdael, the nature is the art. Trees and waterfalls, hills, clouds, architectural ruins, and windmills, so some architectural elements. These are the protagonists instead of human subjects. If there are human subjects, they're distinctly minimalized. Or they may just leave in their path the wake of their agricultural activities. This was painted view of Haarlem at the height of Ruysdael's success. We can see it somewhat in the distance, this view of Haarlem, although it's quite far off. So while it's a view, it's not a close-up view. The most important part of this painting, which is a spacious one, are clouds, fields, the sunlight that connects these natural elements, these irregular patterns of light and shadow. Not what we think of as tenebrism, the sharp contrast of light and dark, but these more delicate, lighter interweavings of light and shadow through a lighter, non-contrasted palette, playing over the organization, which is quite geometric and orderly, of the fields. These are linen bleaching fields where linen is laid out and bleached. Much of the land here, by way of background, was reclaimed from the sea. So the viewer would be standing on dunes that hold, as is common in classic in the Netherlands, that hold the water back. On the far horizon is the church of Sint Bavo, and later on, this is where Ruysdael would be buried. Its spire is connecting earth and heaven. This idea of the connection of earth and heaven is an important one. And if we think back to some earlier Spanish paintings, like the burial of Count Urgas, this idea of uniting earth and heaven is the same type of idea. But what is Ruysdael doing here by way of construction? The composition, again, has areas of light and shadow, leading the eye first across the field and then through the clouds. He brings together these elements, observed and somewhat invented, in a unified vision. It's a very coherent one that emphasizes the interconnectedness of life and emphasizes order. It's got very rich visual detail. The clouds are cumulus clouds, and they're painstakingly accurate, almost meteorologically so. And these famous linen bleaching fields are laid out like an agricultural grid. you have the sense of arriving at this moment when the weather has just changed from being cloudy to one of clear sunshine grazing over the hills. One art historian called Ruysdael's method selective naturalism, meaning that he knew just what to highlight, the epitome of nature, and that his perception of this nature as being God gifted was one held wildly at the time in 17th century Holland. Um, this Dutch idea of religion that was shaped by the Reformed Calvinism of creation. God is seen as original and perfect, and whose own handiwork is copied by human artists. One of the things that stands out in this painting is how much open space is represented. It's full, but it's open. This light that bears upon this open space is again suggesting the presence of God's grace and his blessing upon Haarlem. Haarlem had adopted Calvinism around 1580, so no longer Catholic or primarily Catholic. View of Haarlem is a painting that demonstrates a belief, again, in the universal authority of God over all of creation and culture. Ruysdael doesn't spotlight the church with a beam of light or anything overbearing that would indicate it as being specially sacred. He just integrates it into the landscape. The painting has these daily activities and commercial activities, and everything is equally blessed by the hand of God. This is the idea behind this painting. There's this divinely given charge to cultivate and fill the earth as well. So it's man working in concert with God's grace. The clouds also may be indicating that our ultimate authority is coming from God, that there is a realm higher than our own that is above us. Again, this idea of earth and heaven, above and below. Here we have a similar painting, just to provide some comparison. And we can also see in this treatment, this huge expanse, the greatest real estate in this painting is given over to the heavens, to the sky, to the cloud-filled sky. Recalling that in all of these paintings, there's always a thread, a note of this Dutch belief in the 17th century that their recent religious as well as their political and economic well-being, their religious freedom, and their prosperousness, their prosperity at this time was something that was divinely ordained and linked to this newly won religious freedom. The idea, the symbolic meaning of objects is nowhere more dominant than in Dutch still lifes at the time called vanitas. Vanitas being a type of a still life painting quite prominent in the Netherlands during this period. As mentioned in another audio clip, one of the most obvious of these objects found in Vanitas paintings that possess very direct meanings is the skull, the universal symbol of death, of course. In addition to an object such as a skull, we see these rich vases, often Chinese porcelain, oriental carpets, gilded golden cups, other luxury objects that can be interpreted as what? As a show of wealth, of ostentation, but in a way that is meant as a warning that this is something that should be avoided. The Dutch are classically known to be frugal and not ostentatious in terms of displaying their wealth. There's still many arguments in the realm of art history about the meaning of the objects embedded into these paintings. And once again, we can go back to the Arnolfini double portrait to think about the way that sumptuousness and in Dürer as well, in Dürer's self-portrait, a fur cloak that a man is wearing, rich tapestries, the meaning of mirrors. Some of the common objects found in Vanitas meanings, again, there's the skull, death, This is a very clear message that is embodied in the phrase memento mori, memories of death, transience of life. A watch or an hourglass, the idea that time is limited and is passing quickly. Therefore, one should be prudent and use it wisely. Books, the idea of human knowledge. Artists' instruments, brushes, easels might be found in the painting, um, which resemble it's generally thought, indulging in the arts. Very few could afford to be patrons of the arts at that time, although this was changing with the growing middle class. Shells are normally exotic objects that are not commonly available in the Netherlands, so they symbol the vanity that comes with wealth if they're displayed in a well-to-do person's home. Insects, decaying flowers depict the transience of life. Also, inserted into paintings as expensive objects in terms of the flowers, not the insects, and reminding us that life is temporary and moral considerations deserve more attention than material things. So there are moral lessons embedded into the use of objects in Dutch still life paintings. When we see glassware tipped over, not uncommon at all, quite common in fact, the idea that life is fleeting, seize the day, carpe diem. Musical instruments, the idea of the senses as being luxurious, sometimes in the sense of artistic inspiration as music inspires artists. Velvet or silk, tapestries or tablecloths upon which these objects are resting. Again, the idea of vanity because these are expensive things. Silk is the ultimate expensive fabric at this time, and purple is the most expensive dye. Hence, we see at an earlier time Roman emperors wearing what? Purple tunics. We see purple as a vestment in the Catholic Church as well. Oriental rugs and carpets are commonly shown. These were very expensive items at this time. Carpets were placed on tables to avoid stepping on them in order to prolong their life. Symbols of wealth, but also pride. Jewelry, clothes, and mirrors, again, mirrors the temporal nature of beauty and wealth and wisdom. Mirrors also symbolize the idea of vanity, looking into the mirror that should be avoided. So, some ways to approach the reading of one of these still lifes. The Dutch called these kinds of painting breakfast pieces, breakfast piece, even though, as we can clearly see here, Pieter Claus's Still Life with Tatsa, Tatsa meaning the glass, the romer, which is that thick-stemmed goblet of green glass, isn't really about breakfast at all. It's about much higher things. It's about abundance. For instance, no lemons grow in Holland, no olives, as we see in many of these sorts of paintings. Like the Tatsa on the right, the green glass chalice, likely an Italian chalice, and also the silver one that is overturned. These were probably imported. Look at how ornate they are. They're coming from somewhere else. That costs money. White bread, very white bread, such as we see here, that costs plenty too. Poor folk at that time made do with brown bread. So there's been this reversal of which part of the population, which segment of the population consumes what color, brown or white, of bread. When we look at this painting, at its details, at the way that light sort of caresses the starched linen, the quality of that linen, the sharpness of the knife, everything is executed so perfectly. The gleam, the shine off of the olives. Your mind is meant to roam over all these individual elements and not just to read the meaning, the symbolism behind them, but to almost touch these things that are foodstuffs. They are things that we eat. You can almost taste this wine, which would have been a Rhenish wine, when we see similar pieces that have a clock in them or a watch. We can almost hear that ticking. The citrus of that unraveling of the lemon peel, that sense the air, that's something that we can almost smell. These sorts of images were pretty small in size often, um, so there's something humble and modest about them, but they're also, in terms of the context of the times, social and economic, unquestionably about luxury. Um, and again, this sense of acute accuracy in these renderings, this immaculate precision of the Dutch, who are known for their measuring and mapping, for sailing to Africa and Asia, places they were colonizing, and the grinding of glass lenses. The Dutch were preeminent at the time in terms of their making of lenses and were the very first um, creators of some of the equipment that was even used by some of the early painters. We now know this. What else do we see here? We see this ornate lidded, really. It would have been silver cup. Um, these images also suggest through their harmony and their order, the idea that they have daily bread on the table, this very soft shining of light. There's also this idea of God and sacredness implied, although it's empty of the kind of idolatry, of the kind of lavish worship that one would have seen in the Catholic Church. And that would not have been adapted by Calvinists, who saw it as their duty to actually throw down saintly statues, and it's been documented, even have broken old stained glass windows. At the time, they were even at that time, those were beautiful old ornate stained glass windows in Catholic churches. So whatever we see here in the way of walnuts being cracked and open, the sort of interruption of this meal, the unwinding of that peel and the fallen cup, these are also sort of warnings at the time. So that's another implicit message. Calvin himself wrote at this time, "Let those who have abundance remember that they are surrounded with thorns, and let them take great care not to be pricked by them." So in that sort of a warning, we also again have this idea of mortality. The collectors of paintings such as this at this time, say the citizens of Harlem, who bought these pictures, would put them on their walls in exactly the same places where they might have earlier shown a portrait of the Virgin Mary or a Bible scene. So the idea of the sacred in this new Reformed Calvinism is a subtler one. And even though it's, again, low key, God's invisibility is also present. His presence is there because even if this is a humble meal, saying grace at dinner transforms the objects on our tabletop. Today, when we look at this kind of a still life, Pieter Claus's still life, we see something that seems so perfectly rendered. It's almost miraculous, but Dutch still lifes of this quality, of this level of descriptive painting, are fortunately not rare. Holland boasts, we could even number hundreds of wonderfully skilled painters in this genre who were tagged the Little Masters. And Peter Klaus is actually one of these in the late 19th century. He was, quote unquote, discovered and added to the pantheon of Dutch still life masters, be they large or small. Again, with this genre of still life paintings in the Netherlands at this time, there's this common interpretation of vanitas, a moral message taken from a passage in the Bible reminding us that beauty fades, all living things must die. So there's a dual message really at work here in these still life paintings. On one hand, they're celebrating the beauty, the luxury of fine food, these voluptuous flowers. On the other hand, there's the vanitas, which is a warning about the fleeting nature of these material things and the shortness of life. And when we look at images such as flowers still life, we see some flowers wilting and dying, others have holes from insects in their leaves. Wealthy Dutch consumers at this time are being reminded to not become too attached to their material possessions and worldly pleasures, and that eternal salvation comes only through devotion to God. Rachel Ruysch was very fortunate to be born into a very wealthy and prominent family of Dutch artists, architects, and scientists. Her father was a famous professor or well known professor of anatomy and botany, along with being an eminent scientist, possessing a coveted collection of rare natural history specimens that Rachel helped him catalog and record, so she had an intimate knowledge with the concept as well as the actuality of objects. And her father, Frederick, encouraged this curiosity and thirst for knowledge on her part, along with her artistic talents. And he noticed how her careful observation of the natural world and scientifically accurate renderings of plants and flowers were from an early age quite promising, if not remarkable. So that at 15, she was able to begin an apprenticeship with a famous still life painter, and by 18, producing her first still life paintings and starting off on her career. Important to recall, to remember that women at this time, without the, let's call it familial patronage of a father or another prominent relative, or even in some instances a husband, had few, if any, prospects. There really was not a way for a woman on her own, independently, to begin to forge a career as an artist. Ruysch was also, in addition to being such an accomplished painter, a devoted mother. But again, she had the wherewithal to run a household with, of course, assistance of 10 children, and to at the same time be incredibly prolific. She produced more than 250 paintings over 7 decades, over 70 years. She was considered one of the most successful artists of her day, and many contemporary Dutch writers on art at that time called her an art prodigy. So she occupied an unusually exalted position for a woman in Dutch society and in the art world at her time. When we look at Rachel Ruysch's Flowers Still Life, again, as with all these elements in Dutch still lifes as well as other paintings, we have to put ourselves back into a time when these objects contained different types of meanings and had possessed different social significance. So today, we might think, oh, just a bouquet of flowers. What would we consider the most coveted status symbols today? A Tesla, a Ferrari, diamond watches, designer handbags. In Rachel Ruysch's day, it was a simple tulip. When we look at her floral still lifes, these paintings can reveal an entire hidden world to us. Wealth, status, even the economics behind what was going to be one of the world's worst financial crises. And that had to do with flowers. By the mid to 3/4 of the way through the 1700s in the Netherlands, The country was independent from Spain by then. Again, this ushered in a period of great economic prosperity. The Dutch were involved in a very flourishing international trade, and they grew into this really thriving capitalistic economy. And that resulted, of course, in a newly affluent middle class in Holland at this time. Wealthy merchants created a new kind of patronage. So, without a powerful monarchy at that time or the Catholic Church, because the Dutch are now Protestants, they're freed from Spanish Catholic control. Artists are producing directly for this new affluent merchant market. Um, and those buyers are purchasing from professional dealers, as we have today, or directly from artists. And these big historical and mythological religious painting themes are no longer desirable. These buyers wanted everyday scenes, still lifes, landscapes, portraits to hang on their walls. Again, they're not hanging religious paintings on their walls anymore, and they're proud of their country gaining independence and being so well off and being prospering and having a booming economy. So by the time Rachel Royce came along, her career was really paralleling the growth of one of these new Dutch economies that was horticultural. What are the Dutch known for today? Tulips, fields of them, and other kinds of flowers. The science of botany is important in Holland at the time, and the Netherlands becomes the largest importers of new and quite exotic plants and flowers. And flowers are enormously appreciated and um, assigned a place of prominence on the socioeconomic scale. They're very desirable status symbols for the wealthy, the most important of which is the tulip, of which collectors sought the rarest specimens and examples. There was something in Holland, a phenomenon at this time called tulip mania. Tulips were introduced from Turkey into Holland in the late 16th century, and the Dutch fell madly in love with them. It takes a long time for a tulip to grow from seed, so the demand outpaced supply. The most coveted, desirable tulip was the flamed tulip, which has these kind of feathery, contrasting, bright colors. So the whole phenomenon of tulip mania is today even used to refer to types of economic crises. Tulip bulbs were so desired by the 17th century after being introduced in the 16th in Holland that a futures market was born. And this crashed, hence the association with economic crises and crashes and the phenomenon of tulip mania. It's a long story, but an interesting one about which much has been written. In the past few years, there have been several very interesting cultural studies of the idea, the significance of tulips within Dutch life at this time. So, going back to Rachel Royce's painting here, uh, again, skillful realism is highly prized in terms of Dutch still life painting, and the best examples of that genre. So, to depict, as Rachel Royce does here, in Flower's still life, this profusion, this tumbling into the frame of our view, this profusion of very scientifically accurately rendered floral details of petals, stems, and leaves being so precisely rendered is important to a successful example of this genre. All the textures of the petals, from these very paper thin poppies to the more brittle leaves, all of this is very carefully depicted. Tiny insects like a bee gathering pollen, a white butterfly on a marigold, a caterpillar on a stem are also very much a part of this and similar flower paintings of the time. There's here a very complex arrangement: poppies, snapdragons, a long list of flowers. They include marigolds, hollyhocks, carnations, roses, morning glories, and a single tulip, a red and white tulip. So, one thing Ruysch was known for that's important to note is a more lively, almost informal, again, this sort of idea of tumbling forward looking arrangement. Some of her contemporaries, actually many of them at the time, were creating more symmetrical and formal compositions. This is a more informal one. And the way that she creates her own sorts of symmetry, which is a bit more asymmetrical than symmetrical, is rather ingenious and quite pleasing. The eye diagonally moves from this lower left up to this upper right hand side of the corner. So the way she varies the palette is one that continues to provide both a kind of harmony as well as a diversity that enlivens the flowers and is considered very pleasing, of course, to the eye. As a sort of response to the genre of still life painting so popularized by the Dutch during this time in the 17th century, I'm showing you here two contemporary still lifes, we might call them, by Chicago photographer Laura Litinsky. We see here something quite different than the idea of the voluptuous aspects and the very encoded meaning behind the kinds of flowers, the insects, whether a lemon peel looked wilted, things that referenced mortality, the idea of vanitas that we'll get to a little bit later in images. Here again, not something on your lecture guide, but just the way in which a contemporary photographer is interpreting and appropriating the idea of a genre, in this case, Dutch still lifes. The court of Louis XIV, the sun god as he was known, who is depicted in this portrait, the court adored the painter of this portrait, Hyacinthe Rigaud, who really helped to create and to codify and formulate what a state portrait should be, should look like. While here, Rigaud makes, let's call it a credible likeness of the king, the express purpose behind this portrait was not so much for him to express Louis's or King Louis's character, but to glorify the monarchy, the concept of the French reigning monarchy. So this portrait, now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, was so popular that Rigaud had many copies made, both in full and half-length formats, often, as was the case with many of these master painters during this time, often with the help of assistants. They had studios. And in this portrait, what do we see? What are the details that jump out at us? This, let's call it maybe an elegant stance. I'd call it a foppish one, a little bit overdone, a somewhat haughty expression, and certainly the ceremonial robes are proclaiming the exalted status of the king. Rigaud was very concerned with his specificity of the particulars in his portraits, and we can see even down to the shoe buckles. He has depicted Louis XIV's costume in great details. Does he have a sympathetic expression? I mentioned that I believe it looks a bit haughty and entitled. We will look at a different, in the subsequent slide, quite a different portrayal of the idea of regalness and male authority. I'm introducing here and in the subsequent slide, 134, the work of a quickly rising, since about 12, 15 years ago, the work of the American artist Kehinde Wiley, who does, I think, a more than credible, quite a wonderful and original job of juggling past and present and contrasting ideas of authority and male privilege and agency. Kehinde Wiley takes the conceit of the American black male and endows it with um, not so much a tongue in cheek, but a credible view of authority and, again, regalness, almost a sense of royalty. He's always quite conscious of and in referring us to the idea of male portraiture, particularly those of wealthy or royal subjects of the past. A little bit of background about Georges de la Tour. Although he was not a painter who positioned himself in the cosmopolitan center of Paris in France or elsewhere, his style and his work was just as profound and impactful and well regarded as other um, painters of his skill at that time. So he was recognized and his work was sought out on the same level as those other painters, although he was someone who was far from the major art centers. And it's not quite clear where he trained or what his arts background was in terms of an internship or training. But he did come across in a province of France another artist, Jean Leclerc, who was a devout follower of the Italian painter Caravaggio. And so it's thought in several art history sources that Latour's ability and his interest in rendering realism and simplicity um, in a more arresting way comes from this secondhand association with Caravaggio. De la Tour depicts Mary Magdalene here in a way quite different as she was usually represented, in that she is traditionally depicted in her grotto or as an aged woman. And the absence of any kind of explicit narrative in this painting privileges and emphasizes an emotional quality to her posture and to her placement. It's quite simple. We are more drawn to her state of mind and her heart rather than her feelings, her emotional feelings, rather than any kind of a specific time or place. The setting is basically absent from this composition. And that composition is one of very simple vertical and horizontal shapes that draws her into Magdalene's contemplative mood. Certainly that the presence of scripture, the skull, notably, and the something called the candle, the lighting, the only lighting in this image, which is emanating from the candle, set the scene and become in a way the true subject of the work. The candle is something that Mary is gazing at really in meditation. And when we think about the way candles as sources of light are rendered, this is akin to the same light that St. John called the living flame of love, towards which spiritual pilgrims are drawn out of the dark night of the soul. So the quality of the light as it grazes upon the other surfaces in this room that are all very specifically depicted, the different reflective qualities of the skull, which as it's polished shines, the leather books, the heaviness of the drapery of Mary's skirt, the smoothness of her flesh and hair. These are all very meticulously, as spare as they are, these details are all very specifically and carefully depicted.